In today's world, decisions that shape our lives are less and less made by identifiable individuals. They emerge instead from complex systems, governments, corporations, and algorithms that absorb information, process it, and deliver outcomes that often leave no one accountable. My guest, economist and author Dan Davies, calls this the unaccountability machine. In his book, he explores why big systems make terrible decisions and why responsibility so often vanishes in the process. Our conversation touches on cybernetics, the failure of feedback loops, and the industrialization of decision-making. Listening now, it resonates strongly with current affairs, from the spread of AI-generated disinformation in global politics to financial institutions struggling with systemic risk, to governments overwhelmed by crisis where no one claims ownership of failure. So I invite you to consider, what does accountability mean in an age of black box decision-making? And how can systems be designed so that someone, somewhere, remains answerable for the consequences? This is In Substantia. I'm Gabor, and here is my conversation with Dan Davies. So thank you for accepting my invitation, Dan.
Thanks very much.
Before starting our conversation, please tell us about yourself.
Right. What about me? I still call myself an economist, although I have less and less to do with the mainstream of economics, I think, every year that I do research. But I still earn money by researching and writing about the economy. And I still believe in what I think is the fundamental truth of economics, which is that bygones are bygones. And so on that basis, I will call myself an economist. However, I drifted a long way from economics because I've always been interested in when systems break down and in information and complexity. And these are subjects that I think are handled pretty badly by the mainstream of economics. So this has explained the drift of my career. I started in the 1990s as a bank regulator at the Bank of England. I pretty quickly decided that I wasn't cut out for a civil service career due to an inability to keep my mouth shut, mainly. And so
I can relate.
And so I spent 15 years as a investment banker, basically a sell-side equity research analyst, which was great because I learned a huge amount about the banking system and I went through some of the biggest crises that we've ever experienced. And I really discovered you learn so much more about a system by observing it when it's under stress. One of the big kind of mistakes that economics makes, I think, is to concentrate so much on equilibrium and so much on systems that are functioning well.
What inspired you to explore the concept of unaccountability in modern systems?
It's been a process, basically. I had a long career as a bank analyst, and I was working at a variety of investment banks during the global financial crisis. And that was a very interesting period to work. You learn so much more about a system when you observe it when it's under stress than when you observe it in equilibrium. One of the reasons that I ended up drifting away from the mainstream of economics is that I don't like the way that economics handles equilibrium. I don't think that many systems actually naturally tend towards steady state. In many ways, they need a lot of energy expended on keeping them in steady state. Going through the global financial crisis and a lot of the related criminal scandals associated with it gave me a kind of feeling that there's something strange and something wrong with the way that a lot of big systems operate. My first book after I left the banking industry was called Lying for Money, and that was all about financial fraud. And that kind of reinforced my view that there was something wrong with big systems, because the way that financial frauds work is that they exploit the information environment of someone. The interesting thing about fraud is that at the time you steal the money, the person willingly gives it to you. You don't have to hit them on the head or break into their house. They willingly give you money or valuable goods, even if at a later date they realize that was a mistake. And big companies are much more susceptible to frauds than individuals, because big companies have a very strange and very restricted information environment, which is actually quite easy to manipulate. And then, of course, the biggest victim of fraud is the government, because the government has an incredibly warped and restricted information environment, which is extremely easy to manipulate. And these are the kind of questions I was thinking about. And I ended up basically going down something of a rabbit hole, because when you start thinking about information theory in the context of economics and management, you end up with a whole literature that derived from Norbert Wiener and the book Cybernetics from 1948. And cybernetics was an incredibly interesting project, which kind of ran out of road because it ran into a whole load of problems, both institutional and fundamental. But it was an attempt to use information theory to talk about management and to talk about systems. And one of the big building blocks of kind of the cybernetic approach to management is this idea of a connection between the decision and its consequences. And when you have a two-way connection, you've got a feedback loop. If you don't have that second part of the feedback loop from the consequences to the decision maker, then I would argue that the name that we give to that in society is unaccountability.
We'll come back to cybernetics a little bit later. But on accountability, you speak of accountability sinks. How do you define this concept, and what examples best illustrate?
Yeah, the accountability sink is, I'll give an example, then a definition. If you are taking a flight and you've arrived a little late, then sometimes, particularly if you're on a business flight, you might find that you've been bumped. And you've been bumped because someone with more points in the airline's loyalty system than you needed that flight, and they pulled rank. And when this happens, it's happened to me on 2 occasions on business trips. You get mad and you ask, who made this decision? And the trouble is that the person that you're talking to at the gate, you can't get mad at them because they didn't make the decision. You say, can you give me the phone number of the CEO so that I can get mad at him? And he says, no, that's not our policy. So they've created this really strange situation whereby they speak to you with the voice of an anonymous corporate system, but you have to talk to them as if they were a normal human being. And it's a very weird, frustrating situation to be in. But what's happened here is that even if you got through to the CEO, you wouldn't find someone who admitted that they'd made the decision to bump you from the flight. They would say, I'm under a duty to maximize shareholder value, and my marketing department have told me that the benefits from our rewards program are greater than the bad publicity we get from bumping you from this flight. And if you passed you onto the marketing department, they wouldn't admit to making that decision either. They would say, we didn't bump you from that flight. We have data and evidence that shows that this is the best way for us to maximize shareholder value over the long term. And then you go onto the data team, and the data team will go, no, you are not pinning this one on me. Come on. What's happened here is that we've got a situation that I call the accountability sink, which is an institutional arrangement designed to protect anyone from being held accountable for the consequences of their actions. We've got a arrangement of policies which create a decision that nobody owns. effectively, because it's not just the decision to use the kind of hourly paid employee at the gate as a human shield for everyone else in the company. It's also the policy that means that there is no way to get that decision reversed. Because if accountability for a decision is intrinsically linked to the ability to change that decision. If you can change something, then you're accountable for not having done so. If you can't change something, then there can be no accountability. And at the absolute root of the accountability thing is this weird concept that we have these days of decisions that just arrive without there being an identifiable individual who made them.
Yes. In that case, and often it's the case, we get mad at an algorithm.
Which is crazy.
Because it's been programmed to make decisions based on a certain number of data. And that's super funny.
Yeah.
Your book has been a deep dive into notions I must confess I knew little about. For one, I was reminded that cybernetics is not limited to robotics. For me, it was associated more with Asimov. Yes. So it's not limited to robotics and artificial intelligence. The science is much, much broader. What does cybernetics encompass?
Well, the original book, Cybernetics by Norbert Wiener, had the subtitle Information and Control in the Machine and Animal, which is just a great title. Unfortunately, it's not a great book. It's incredibly difficult to read. But it came out of a whole lot of people's war work, basically, in the Second World War. In particular, Norbert Wiener was employed by the United States Air Force to design an automated gun sight for tracking anti-aircraft fire. And the idea here from that automated gun sight is that there is some quantity which is preserved from the gun sight, from the radar, through the wires, to a servo motor, through the operator of the gun, and to then the eventual consequence of a hit or miss. There's some kind of quantity that's constantly preserved through there. And Wiener's big mental leap was to say this quantity is information. And that's where information theory started. And cybernetics is kind of the double of information theory because it is information theory in the context of control, rather than having as your stereotypical task the transmission of an arbitrary set of symbols, the transmission of an arbitrary message across a noisy channel. Your kind of ideal task when you're considering the same equations as part of cybernetics is the delivery of an arbitrary set of instructions intended to have a consequence in cause and effect at the other end, again, in a noisy environment. And this is the idea originally was that this was how you would create an artificial brain. It absolutely was. Everyone who got into kind of social sciences read Isaac Asimov's Foundation series. Everyone who got into cybernetics read Asimov's Robot series. This was all in the air in the 1940s and 50s. Because, going back to that automated gun turret, there were two problems that it could have. Either the feedback was too slow and it constantly dragged behind the target, or the feedback was excessive and it kept on overcorrecting in one direction, then overcorrecting its overcorrection and oscillating in that way. And Wiener and some of his friends decided that these two conditions were very similar to the symptoms of certain kinds of brain injury. They were either, the gun sight was either neurotic and wouldn't respond to its environment, or it had a purpose tremor and constantly overcorrected to its internal signals. And this was something that looked really promising in the early days and in early models. And it turned out not to be as promising as it looked, basically because the world is too complicated.
It is indeed. You discussed and talk about many influential cyberneticians, but your main focus in the book is Stafford Beer.
Yeah.
Who was he, and what about him and his theories are fascinating?
Stafford Beer was just this crazy guy. He was a hippie management consultant in the days when that was a thing. He was friends with Brian Eno and David Bowie, but he also was the manager at United Steel responsible for 3 times productivity improvement. What he was basically an applied mathematician who took on the ideas of cybernetics and said, how do we apply these to the industry? And that turned out to involve quite a lot of big mental jumps, because it's quite easy to make a model of information flows when you have control of the full information environment. When you're doing that, you're doing engineering, because you can tell a computer to produce a set of outputs from a set of inputs. And the math it can be very difficult, but it's basically straightforward. When you go into a situation where you're actually trying to design control systems involving human beings in a factory, even in a relatively simple factory with relatively straightforward flow of control, like a steelworks, suddenly you've got an information set that is many orders of magnitude larger, and it's completely intractable. So at this point, you have to start saying, the mathematics I learned as a control engineer is only going to be useful to me in a metaphorical sense. I've learned things about simple mathematical objects, and I'm going to assume that I can apply those same principles to much more complicated real-world objects. And what Stafford Beer did was to say, here's a set of information engineering design principles which you can use so that you are respecting the ideas of information theory and control theory in a context where you're never really going to be able to check up on things in terms of a number of bits per second or a kind of a formal calculation as if you were doing information theory. That's abstract. I'll give you an example of one of these principles, which is, I think, just a kind of really powerful management idea, and it's derived from really simple mathematics. So in information theory, very fundamental theorem, you cannot send more information over a communication channel than the bandwidth of that channel, just simply pretty much defining bandwidth. If you apply that in a management context, you get something called Ashby's law, or the principle of sufficient variety, which just says anything which wants to regulate or control a system has to be able to process at least as much variety as the variety generated by that system, which is, it's getting close to a rigorous definition of management capacity, because we all know what it looks like for a manager to be over capacity. They stop processing information. They start missing things. They start dropping bits. And what they are doing is doing exactly the same thing that a telecom system does when it drops calls. They are trying to bring their capacity back into line with the information that's coming in by dropping things. So you have a useful management principle here. You've got to design your management systems so that at every point, the information balance sheet balances, so that at every point, the information coming in is coming in a volume where it can be handled with the resources available. And so that's giving you a new vision of a company or of a government or of any organization that's very different from that of mainstream economics, in my view, which is to say, this is an information processing system. A company is a system which takes information from the outside world, converts it into decisions which have an effect on the world, and then continues. And it's a system which needs to remain in equilibrium because the information balance sheet has to balance, just in the same way that supply and demand have to balance, because otherwise they're going to be brought back into balance.
So you use Stafford Beer's viable system model framework to explain failures in organizational design leading to unaccountability. How would you explain it, and how is this framework adequate to analyze our current paradigm?
So Stafford Beer's viable system model it's the subject of 3 big, dense books by Stafford himself, by quite a lot of other commentary from the kind of 1970s when people were still doing this sort of thing. If anyone listening to this podcast is familiar with it, I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm going to oversimplify mightily. The idea of the viable system model is that you've got 5 crucial components of an organization considered as an information processing system. You have the bottom level, which is the operations, and the operations, the part of the organization which interacts directly with the outside world. It's the part where information comes in initially from the outside world, so say from customers, if you're a commercial organization, and it's the part which has a direct effect on the environment. So you've got that number 1 level. It's hard not to call it the lowest level of the organization because that's the way conventional org charts are drawn. Cyberneticians like to draw org charts tilted through 90 degrees to emphasize that it's not the lowest status, it's just the people who deal with the outside world. You then have a system called the regulatory subsystem, which just deals with preventing resource clashes between the operations. Classic example of that would be at a university. You have the professors who teach the students. Professors are very definitely operations. They're the lowest level of the system because they come into contact with the world. And you might have a timetable. A timetable is a level 2 regulatory system because it stops all of the professors trying to use the same lecture hall at once. It deals with kind of preventing the operations from getting in the way of each other. One step up from the regulatory operations, you have the optimization layer. So the first of the systems that really where you start calling things management. So the optimizational layer is responsible for directing the operations to effectively interact with the outside world in a way that pursues the goals of the organization. And we'll talk about how you define what those goals of the organization are later, because the goals of the system can be very different from the goals of any of the people working within it, but we might come back to that later. Those kind of 3 operations can be grouped together as a kind of operational management, but they are only ever dealing with the here and now. A system that only has those 3 levels will fall apart when the world changes because it is adapted to a particular environment. So you need a meta system. Again, it's hard not to use the word higher level here. That shouldn't be considered as higher level in an org chart. It's like the higher functions of your brain. So you have an intelligence system. The intelligence system is dedicated to getting information from parts of the outside world that the organization is not interacting with. Usually parts of the outside world that the organization is not interacting with because they don't exist yet. One of the key jobs of the intelligence function is to get information about what is going to happen in the future. And then you have a problem because you've got a system that is looking at the future and you've got the current operations. The system that's looking at the future is taking in and generating a certain amount of information and needs to communicate that and have an effect on the operational layer. But there's only a certain amount of ability of the operational layer to process that information. The balance sheet's got to balance. There's only a certain amount of ability of the operational layer to change in response to new information. So what you have to do is you have to have another function which balances present and future. You have a function which makes the decisions about how much of the future regarding and outside regarding information the organization is going to take on board and allow itself to be affected by. And that final layer, I'm not going to say highest layer because this shouldn't be thought of as a hierarchy, is what Stafford Beer called philosophy and identity. And that's, again, one of the big insights that you get from regarding this thing as an information processing system, which is that fundamentally the property of identity or of culture is about balancing future with present. The culture or the identity of an organization is what determines how it is going to change in response to information about the outside world that it's not yet in contact with. And so there you have.
In such a system, overcoming the natural resistance to change makes it one of the hardest aspects of coordinating all the levels and all the systems working together smoothly.
Yeah, absolutely. And conversely, if you have a system that's too fluid and which changes too much in response to outside stimuli, then it never gets anything done in the here and now. If we think of some of because the reason that this is called the viable system model is that Stafford Beer argues that all 5 of those components have to be there for a system to be able to be robust to shocks that were not anticipated when it was being designed. A viable system is one that can adapt and has at least a chance of surviving things that it wasn't expecting. If you look at some of the very longest lived institutions that we have in the world, I don't know, classic example that organization theorists always talk about is the Roman Catholic Church. They change, but they don't change very quickly. They have obviously a very strong philosophy, a very strong identity. It's literally a religion. And that has the function of balancing the need for change with the capacity to change and making changes. I was baptized into it. I don't know how familiar you are with the Catholic Church. It always changes and gets used to the real world at the very last moment possible, is my experience. But that's one way of doing it. Conversely, we all know about organizations that restructure themselves constantly the moment there's a new trend. They're always pivoting. They're pivoting to crypto. They're pivoting to AI. And they end up using up all their energy doing that. They don't achieve anything and they fall apart the other way. So it's very much that balancing function and that function of deciding what information you're going to pay attention to.
You explained that the growing complexity of modern systems combined with problems in economic theory and management makes it harder to find out who is responsible when things go wrong. You use the metaphor, the black box. What is and what isn't inside that black box?
And I think the big message is that you don't gain anything by knowing what's inside the black box anymore. Because we've drifted a bit into talking about information and complexity. And it might seem that this hasn't got much to do with accountability, but my argument is that it's got everything to do with the end of personal accountability, because we've reached a stage at which all these decisions come to us from algorithms and processes and just simply through systems where human beings are compromising with each other to the extent that none of the individual human beings really feels like they own the decision. But we've got that way because it's the only way that we can manage the economy anymore. The trouble is that Complexity tends to grow exponentially. And it tends to grow exponentially because the number of connections between things grows as a power of the number, of nodes in a network. In a square lattice, it grows as the square of the number of nodes. Complexity grows exponentially. Capacity to manage grows roughly linearly. Now, exponential versus linear is a race that only ever has one winner. And so we get to a point at which we have to reorganize things so that they become literally manageable. And the way that we reorganized society since the Second World War, and particularly since the 1970s and which was both the really beginning of the computer age and the beginning of modern kind of shareholder financial capitalism, is that these decisions are too complex to be taken by identifiable individuals anymore. We have these people who we think of as managers and we think of as leaders in the sense that we've grown up to think of leaders over however many thousand years of human cultural evolution, but they're not leaders in the same way that Alexander the Great was. They're not even leaders in the same way that John Paul Getty was in the 1920s. These are the operators of an industrial decision-making machine. And I've got knives and forks. In my house, I've got kitchen knives. I've got some kitchen knives that were made by an individual craftsman who signed them. It's a very nice kitchen knife. I've also got a knife that I bought from IKEA that was made in a factory. Mm-hmm. My IKEA knife, there is no individual person who could say, I made that, because they came out of an industrial cutlery making machine. Similarly, mm-hmm. when the decisions are coming out of an industrial decision making machine, the operator of that machine doesn't relate to them in the same way that the kind of an artisanal craftsman-like decision maker, of whom there are fewer and fewer every year. Movie directors, probably the last people who make decisions that affect serious amounts of money and then are held accountable for them as people. There's fewer and fewer every year. So yeah, we've got this new system. That's the black box. Going into the black box isn't the way forward. The thing that we have to do is to find a way to make the black box accountable, which is crazy and it's impossible. You can't get mad at an algorithm, or at least you can punch it, but it will not feel pain. It will not, you can praise it, but it will not love you. We have to find something that is equivalent to accountability for the black box. And my argument in the book is that equivalent for accountability is responsiveness. It's feedback. We have to find a way to rebuild those feedback links so that the black box is no longer just a box that's sending decisions down that have an effect on us, that we're able to communicate back up, and to the people at the bottom of the chart, or if you're stuck here on the left side of the chart, have some mm-hmm. way of feeding their information back into the box and making it responsive.
We'll see how much of a challenge this is. While previous centuries had to deal with their polycrisis, the one touching us in the 21st century is amplified by new technologies that brought about new societal trends and explosion of new economic and behavioral science theories. How did this create the industrialization of decision-making, and how does that impact individual responsibilities? And maybe we can start by defining what you mean by the industrialization of decision-making.
I think by industrialization of decision-making, the same thing that Adam Smith identified in his famous description of the pin factory at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It's the standardization of decisions and the standardization of information sets so that they can be processed more efficiently in greater bulk at lower cost. Because what we've actually been doing, and I particularly mark financial capitalism as one of the big drivers of this, is that I was saying a couple of minutes ago when we were talking about the viable system model, that the philosophy determines the information set. It determines what information you pay attention to. And if you know what information a system pays attention to and what information item, what kinds of information can have an effect on its actions, I would argue that you know everything you need to know about the culture of that organization. An organization might say that it has a commitment to diversity, for example, but if you know that it doesn't measure diversity, you know that it doesn't actually have a commitment to that. It's that's not part of the information set. And what we've been doing as corporations grew bigger, as they grew more widely owned through financial instruments, and in particular, as debt finance became much more important to the overall economy, is necessarily that changes the information set for top management. Kind of a family-owned company with no debt and no outside shareholders can basically do what it likes. It can pay attention. It can make its own choices. It can have its own culture. It might be good or bad. Now, I'm not saying all of that's the ideal ownership structure by any means, but it has a very wide set of information that it could choose to pay attention to. A company with outside shareholders has to compile accounts. It has to publish those accounts. It has to publish those accounts annually. Immediately, you've got an assumption making its way into the information set. I used to teach elementary accounting and in the context of fraud, and I always used to tell students the most misleading number in a set of accounts is the dates across the top. Because the dates across the top are telling you, without you even realizing it, that 1 year is a meaningful time period for this company. It's telling you should be judging the performance of this company over a period of 90 days, which might not be true at all. But once you've got outside shareholders, you have to produce accounts. They're intrinsically part of your information set. Once you take on debt, you have to pay even more attention to financial matters, because that's now part of your survival condition as a company. No matter what your other priorities might be, if you don't generate enough cash to service the debt, then you're not going to be able to pursue any of those other priorities. And then you get to the kind of end result of kind of the leveraged buyout boom of the 1980s and 90s and the modern private equity industry, where you have plenty of companies which are so indebted that they basically can't pay attention to anything else. The need to maintain debt service has become just a turned up siren signal that drowns out all other possible sources of information. And that's my view of what's been changing. We've changed the kinds of information that our organizations pay attention to in these ways. And it's dangerous because this reduces their information set. If you've ever been involved with accounts, if you've ever had to compile a set of accounts, or you've ever had to analyze a set of accounts, you know that is a very rough, very low resolution picture of the corporation. If those numbers become kind of the main information source, then it's possible for corporations to get you very far away from reality. And this can be really bad because we have during the pandemic, we discovered that a load of our elderly care homes were owned by private equity. And if you've got a hospital or an elderly care home where the number one thing that they pay attention to every day is the financial reports, then you can get into some very bad trouble indeed, because a hospital fundamentally should not be mainly focused on financial information. It shouldn't be that kind of an organization. But when you take a hospital and load it up with debt, it's going to pay attention to that. And therefore, its culture will change, even though nearly all of the individual people managing it still want to treat patients, because the organization can have a different purpose from any of its constituent parts.
The similar issues impact politicians and governments because they are elected into office for a given period of time. And in some countries, it's limited to they can be just elected twice. And so the first part is to make sure that they'll be given a second mandate and they are not able to engage in projects that might need more than 4, 5, or 6 years. And the changes that needs to be done or implemented that will take longer cannot be started because they might be very unpopular at the beginning, and then they run the risk of not being reelected.
Yeah, and and they have to pay attention to all the wrong things. They have to pay attention to opinion polls. They have to pay attention to donors. If you ever want to get really scared for the future of humanity, make friends with not even a federal congressperson, a US state representative, and ask them how much of their given day they spend trying to raise money. You've got a friend of mine always says that there was a bad day sometime at the end of the 1980s when the Democratic Party of the United States of America stopped being a political organization that needed to raise money and started becoming a fundraising organization that had politics as one of its inputs.
So to what extent do I misunderstand the fact that there is now a deliberate tendency to complexify the organization of political and industrial systems to render accountability impossible?
I don't think you misunderstand that. I think that the thing is that when people are faced with a world which is naturally getting more complex on its own simply because it's growing, they do the thing that we were talking about earlier. They have to bring their information balance sheet back into balance. And so they have to reduce the amount of information that they personally are being asked to process. In order to do that, you create rules. Because if you create a rule, then you can delegate a whole load of your kind of information processing responsibility or decision-making responsibility to that rule, and you can concentrate on kind of the difficult decisions that you want to make. But you start proliferating rules, and then the rules interact in kind of complex and hard to predict ways. And sooner or later, you're spending a load of your time just dealing with conflicting cases where kind of some of the regulatory system has itself become inconsistent. And this is a big problem because the one thing that people won't do is employ more middle managers. Every organization seems to have this obsessive idea that it's a good idea to remove capacity from middle management because those guys don't directly produce anything. They're not level 1 operations. They're not directly interacting with the world. They're just dealing with purely internal matters. They don't have a revenue line associated with them. They look like pure deadweight costs. And you think we'll replace those guys with a computer. And so everything just becomes more and more complex because people are trying to get the decisions made without paying salaries for people to make them. And that will be my diagnosis of how this happens. Then we get to the final stage of how this results in unaccountability, because at the end, people always notice what's the source of all these problems. The source of all these problems is the damn customers. The source of all these problems is the service users. It's the students. It's the people with whom we are interacting. What we need to do, people are going to end up saying, is attack this problem at its source. We are going to cut some of these communication channels. We're going to delegate something to a policy with no appeals process. We're going to create the accountability sink. And that is going to slow down the flood of information that is reaching us. That's going to help us manage our own internal kind of information balance sheet and restore equilibrium to ourselves. It's not ideal, but it's a very human response. It's a self-defense mechanism. It's a coping mechanism for these managers and organizations that they end up creating unaccountability, because the alternative is to be overwhelmed with a flood of information that they can't manage.
So you critique mainstream economics. What specific aspects of economic theory you find most problematic regarding accountability?
I think the trouble with economics as it is these days is that it just doesn't analyze anything interesting, or it doesn't analyze anything interesting to me. What you have in modern economics is a very dumbed down version of a organization or of a person. It's a black box, but it's not even a complicated black box. It's a black box with inputs and outputs that consist of price and quantity. Economic systems and analysis can get plenty complicated just looking at price and quantity, but price and quantity signals are small. They're not a rich kind of representation of the sort of information that an actually existing firm or an actually existing consumer is taking in, or of the decisions that they're making. And as a result, I think economics has just got further and further from being able to say anything interesting about the problems that actually matter in the world today.
What would be a richer metric than just what comes in and goes out?
The thing that's always bugged me ever since I was at business school myself is that economics does not have any useful, non-embarrassing theory of marketing and advertising. It's just, we've got a whole huge industry, marketing, advertising, media, and because of the assumptions made by economists to make the world analyzable for them, it's got nothing, literally nothing to say about those kinds of things, because it's talking about commodities, and the whole business of advertising, marketing, and media is not to be a commodity and to be something that's unique. Economics has surprisingly little to say about strategy. You can get into models of game theory, but if you've ever talked to someone who's in the strategy planning or strategy consulting industry, they'll always say that game theory is interesting to look at, but you can only ever use it metaphorically. The actual mathematical models just become too complicated when applied to anything other than a toy system consisting of two people, or at a maximum 3, playing a simple iterated game. And in the world we live in, kind of marketing matters, branding matters, strategy matters, messaging, communication just matters a huge amount. And it's very difficult for a way of thinking that's based on the assumption that you're going to be dealing with a commodity and that you're going to be dealing with a simple demand function that obeys the standard axioms. It's non-satiable, it's monotonic, it's independent. It's very difficult to get from that starting point to a point where you can say much that's interesting about the modern world. It's designed for a world in which the main things that we were interested in were bulk iron or bulk coal or bulk wheat. In the same way that the accounting is great for factories and railroads, it's brilliant for railroads, but it doesn't handle intangible assets well at all.
You highlight that economic models are inadequate for understanding and managing real-world systems because they simplify complexities, mainly how information processing is done. With the deliberate or unfortunate bias existing in the data fed to AI systems, how impactful will that be in the future?
That's a huge problem, and we know it's a problem in the future because we know that it's a problem now. Because, look, my whole argument here is that corporations are information processing systems. Governments are information processing systems. In a way, Microsoft or General Electric is an artificial intelligence. In a way, the government is an artificial intelligence because it makes decisions, it takes information and acts on it, and it's not a human being. So it's got some of the properties of an artificial intelligence. And we know that it makes a huge and horrible difference and results in extraordinary amounts of bias when governments have the wrong information fed to them. We have certain kinds of things get done and certain kinds of things get cut because some kinds of project are easy to justify in a cost-benefit analysis on a spreadsheet, and some kinds of project are less easy to justify in exactly that way. And so you have huge amounts of activity. I'm involved with a couple of climate science movements over here to try and bring climate risk and environmental degradation into the accounting framework and to find some ways of quantifying and bringing that into the accounting framework, which it's a great project. I try my best to help. I love all my colleagues who are trying to do that. But if you take a step back, you think, isn't that kind of crazy that we have a huge existential threat to humanity, and the only way that we can deal with it is by trying to create an accounting standard that will make someone pay attention to it? Shouldn't we have an organization or a way that our economy and government system was set up so that it could just pay attention to carbon dioxide without needing to convert it into something that you can put into a spreadsheet? And so those kind of biases in the kind of information that it's possible to consider, they're already with us. They're already causing huge problems now. In the future, when we have AI and when we have absolutely unknown biases in training data sets, that's only going to get worse and worse. Another example these days, lots of very smart people work on search engine optimization, on SEO. It's a big part of the marketing industry.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got human beings who are trying to work out how to advertise to a robot. That's kind of crazy because that's what search SEO is. It is spending your time as a human being trying to work out what's going to look most appealing to an algorithm and manipulating the data set there. It's quite possible that in the future, a large part of the human race will be spending its time on trying to create training data that the artificial intelligences will take into account in order to steer them into making decisions that another artificial intelligence has decided are the right ones.
Isn't this an example of biased or not carefully thought out feedback loop?
Yeah.
Because the SEOs will promote pages based on how many times they've been cited and how many times people have visited them. Same things apply in how scientific articles are being quoted. That's similar, but isn't that a problematic feedback loop?
Yeah, absolutely. And to a very large extent, a lot of human activity has always been trying to correct anomalous data. A lot of the work of middle managers is always in taking the data, understanding how it's biased or understanding how it's not a proper representation of reality, and then fudging or correcting the numbers so that the information is cleaned up to work that way. It's not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself, but when you're always fudging the numbers and when your whole life is spent trying to correct the data, then you should probably go back to the original collection process and ask whether something should be changed. But this is what I think is the problem that we're facing. We've got a whole load of these bad feedback loops. We've got a whole load of this misorganized information. And a large part of it is because we don't really think systematically about the kind of information that we're trying to collect. We don't systematically think about what sorts of information our systems should be paying attention to. because we don't really have a very strong identity generating function. We don't really, in a lot of organizations, and particularly in a lot of governments, really know what it is that we're for. We don't really know what we should be paying attention to because we've never really thought systematically about that.
The essential aspect of feedback loops that you mention in the book, in order to adapt the systems, is a very tricky aspect, because you have to carefully decide if the data that's coming in is the one that you really need to pay attention to.
Absolutely. And in many ways, I think that's the essence of leadership. This is all about organizing and keeping an institution running over time in a difficult and complex environment. It's not going to be an easy task, but it's the essential task. It's one of my very favorite quotes, I put it in the book, is from John Kenneth Galbraith, which has said that all the great leaders have one thing in common, which is that they face up to the main anxiety of their time and take it seriously. And that, and little else, is basically the essence of leadership. Which is why when someone, even an incredibly unlikely candidate like Donald Trump, can become a figurehead to millions just simply by saying that they're going to look at some of the big problems and they're going to try and deal with it, even if their actual suggestions are stupid, even if they've got very many undesirable personal qualities. What people are looking for is someone who's actually prepared to make statements and to have these priorities. And the trouble is that's difficult and it's an unpleasant task. And so a lot of people in leadership positions just prefer to avoid doing it and to hope that the system will stabilize itself.
We have to wonder what kind of political systems would avoid having those accountability things. In direct democratic systems such as Switzerland, decisions are made mainly by citizens. We know that data manipulation, lobbying, and fake news can influence the population the same way politicians in different political systems might be influenced by stakeholders, or stakeholders with ulterior motives. To what extent can this be likened to the industrialization of decision-making? And what are the implications for individual responsibility?
I think it's the same problem. And I think the implication is quite clear that the political decision-making units need to be smaller, because these things have grown complicated because they are big. And because they are big, there are more connections. Because they are big, they are more complex. That's something that can't be reversed. But what you can do is delegate things down to smaller decision-making units. These things need to be pushed down to decision-making units as small and as local as possible. And someone needs to put a lot of work into finding out what the smallest decision-making unit that is viable actually is, with then kind of involvement and extra capacity from the top when a smaller decision-making unit gets into trouble. The only algorithm that we really have found that has any chance of addressing these sorts of things is a kind of divide and conquer algorithm. So that, I think, is just, this is a wall behind me, not a whiteboard, so I can't sketching things out. But I think you can probably show from reasonable kind of analogies with algorithms of information theory and computer science that devolution and delegation is the only way to bring this kind of system back into some sort of regulation. But I think that also helps with accountability as well. Because the lower down the decision is delegated, the more likely it is that people are going to be able to have feedback into that process. I can talk to my local councillor in the street. If I have a problem with my local council, I don't need to go to a local council meeting or vote in local council elections. I happen to know what cafe she has her morning coffee at. So if I think there's a problem, I have those informal links and those kind of social connections. It's just much easier to do that with smaller and delegated decision-making units than it is with big units that have to work for an entire nation of millions of people. And that has the advantage that people feel listened to, because what we're all talking about here, and what I think is the root of Adam Tooze's polycrisis, is that the way that systems have been set up, people do not feel like they are being listened to. And we know that not being listened to is one of the most unbearable things. It's if you've ever brought up kids, that not being listened to is just fundamentally unbearable for human beings. Anyone who's been in a bad relationship knows this. And when people are not listened to, they will do anything to get attention. They will vote for extremely bad politicians who promise to listen to them. But to be honest, if voting for bad politicians was the worst thing that people do in order to try and get attention, it wouldn't be so bad. They will try much worse things than that if they feel like they're not being listened to. And so, now that's the big challenge, to build back some kind of links so that people don't feel like they need to take extreme actions in order to, and being listened to doesn't mean being pandered to. It doesn't mean having everything that you say given to you. It just means having that sense that someone has taken your information and your communication, and that it's at least entered into the decision processes that have an effect on your life.
I remember reading a few years ago an article about an entrepreneur, might have been Richard Branson, I'm not sure now, who was talking about the way he was approaching developing businesses. And he was saying that when a unit or a company reached more than 125 employees, he would create another company or separate unit, because when you got past that number of people, then it couldn't function normally. There wasn't a dynamic that allowed for the company to grow, because people started not knowing each other, not being able to relate to one another.
Yeah. And that's probably true in politics as well. And if you bear that in mind, it's obvious why it's much more difficult to run the world when it's got 7 billion people in it than it was even a few decades ago when it had 2 or 3 billion people in it. It's just so much more difficult to divide everything up into units of 150 people anymore.
It is. With the different metaphors that you use, you demonstrate that the issues of unaccountability are not isolated incidents, but are deeply embedded within the structure and function of complex systems. Effective solutions will have to address systemic flows. Where to start then?
Well,
is that making companies smaller, units smaller, but what else?
My favorite metaphor in the whole book is that if you are in the driver's cabin of a train, there is a red handle there. And that red handle is an emergency brake for the train. But I would argue that red handle is mainly an organizational and administrative tool. Because when that handle is pulled, it physically stops the train. But if you just stop one train on a railway and don't do anything else, something bad is really going to happen. So the main function of that red handle is that it sends a signal to the rest of the railway that it's got to start rewriting the timetable, and it's got to start rerouting the whole network. And that kind of signal is really important. Normally, on a normal day, a train driver isn't allowed to rewrite the timetable. But when they pull that red handle, they're sending a signal that crosses all the levels of the organization, right down to the control center. You send a signal saying something has happened which is intolerable to the system. Something has happened which requires a significant rewriting of the plans, and that signal has come from the operations. There's not a special monitoring team with kind of drones or GPS. It's someone who's in the cab of a train who has been able to make that decision. And those kinds of signals are really important. The trouble is that those kind of signals in most organizations are exactly the sort of thing that gets cut because they're rarely used. They don't respect the organizational hierarchy, and they tend to deliver bad news. And so something like that is never going to have a lot of money spent on its maintenance. It's never going to be the most popular kind of job in the organization. But those are the signals which carry the kind of feedback that I call accountability, that we call accountability. So you just have to design organizations so that those signals can get through. And if you don't, then one day something intolerable to the organization will happen, and there will be no way to get that message from the operational levels to the levels that could do something about it.
And we might be blaming someone who was not given the opportunity to be that messenger.
If you read reports of public inquiries into something horrible that's happened, as I did a lot when I was researching for this book, you'll almost always find that all the information was there. You'll almost always find that all of the information needed to make the right decision was there, but it was not acted upon because there was no systems that were capable of turning that information into a signal that the organization recognized as important to its purpose.
AI is a rapidly advancing field with significant implications for society. Two critical components of AI systems are data and algorithms. But the complexity of how they interact, especially in deep learning models, can often result in the black box phenomena where the decision-making processes are not easily interpretable. What is needed for advanced AI systems to offer tools that will improve communication and accountability in complex systems?
I'm relaxed about interpretability, to be honest, because we've been dealing with black boxes for a long time. Human beings are black boxes to one another. We feel like we understand each other, but we never really do. Organizations and committees are black boxes. I had an amusing conversation with someone at the European Commission once, because they had passed a set of the original AI regulations, in which they gave all European citizens a right of explainability. So the idea was that any EU citizen who had a decision made affecting them by an algorithm had the right to request an explanation of how the algorithm came to that decision. And I thought that's a great answer, but it's very strange to be getting this coming from the European Commission. So I asked my friend who worked there, when you at the European Commission make a decision that affects me, what rights of explainability do I have from you? And he told me not to be silly, because the answer is you don't. The European Commission is a black box. So we're used to dealing with black boxes. It's strange and weird that it's literally a black box in the sense that it's literally a computer that's contained in a box colored black. But I think we'll get used to that. The interesting thing to me is that these are literally information technologies. And so they change the information balance sheet. They change the terms of trade in which we manage the information in versus decisions out flows that all of the managers have to prioritize. And that should mean that they have profound consequences for how we design our organizations, because our organizations were designed for one set of assumptions about how easily and quickly you can process information. This is a huge technological change. We've seen this happen in the past. The American railroads reorganized their structures 3 or 4 times with the invention of new communications technologies. The electric telegram made a huge difference to the organization of railroads, which obviously by their nature had to span the entire continent. And there were massive corporate and organizational changes which followed from that. One thing that's disappointing about the IT revolution is how little organizational change has resulted from it for most of its life. In the 1970s, when mainframe computers were being installed, Stafford Beer made the joke. He said, "You've got a machine here with huge amounts of potential, and you've used it to automate your payroll system and to just basically automate all of the processes you were doing before. It's like you had the opportunity to hire Shakespeare, Galileo, and Einstein, and then you put them to work memorizing the phone book so that you could look up numbers more quickly." And that was his view on IT and the American corporate workplace in the 1970s. And it's only many years later that we're seeing slightly different organizational forms develop that take advantage of the technology we have now. It would be just a real shame. It would be just such a huge waste if we took all of the potential of AI and deep learning and transformer neural networks and used it to send more emails. And I have a real kind of fear that's what we're going to end up doing with it.
Yes, or we use that technology just for entertainment when we could do more with it. Your book is extremely dense, and there are so many topics that you discuss in length that we could have a separate podcast on all the different issues going on for hours. In the questions that I've asked, I tried to go in one direction. Do you feel that I've missed something, that there are some issues that I should have brought up?
No, I don't think so. I think these are all the things that I wanted to talk about in the book. It was, writing this book was difficult for me. It involved holding things in my brain that my brain was not designed to hold.
Such as?
Not just the entire structure. This little head was never meant to understand cybernetics, and it was not.
You mentioned how difficult writing chapter 6, right?
Yeah, it was. I had to teach myself more mathematics than I like knowing. I've never had a good relationship with mathematics. It's always been pure pain. But talking about the kind of issues over the last 6 months has helped me understand much more what it is that I wanted to say in the book. And I think that with the things we've been talking about over the last hour or so, have been exactly in that direction.
You also say that during the period of writing, you changed your mind a few times on certain things.
Oh, yeah.
What were the things you changed your mind on, and what were the triggers?
The thing is, this book should have been published at least a year earlier, and it would have been easy to write, and it would have had a nice, straightforward structure to it, because I wanted to write the book just saying that managers are trying to cover their asses and avoid accountability, and aren't they bad for doing that? And that's terrible, and we should make them all accountable. And it would have been an easy book. I could have appeared on television talking about how much I hated managers. Everyone would have loved me. But I just ended up thinking, actually, this is not honest. These managers are not just avoiding accountability because they are despicable people. They're avoiding it because they don't feel like they're taking the decisions. And they don't feel like they're taking the decisions because actually in most cases they're not making the decisions. And I've got to write about that. I've got to actually respect the complexity of the underlying reality. The other thing that happened while I was writing the book was the entirety of large language models. The day I signed the contract for the book, one of my friends left his job at a hedge fund to work at a startup working on LLM image generation, which wasn't even a thing then. By the time I was finishing the book, the large language models were on the evening news. That's how fast those things have happened.
Yes, it's quite incredible. Actually, when I started the book and when I decided that this was an interesting topic, This is actually what I was thinking I was going to find, what you mentioned. That was the premise that you had. And going through deep diving, I had to stop a few times because they were taking me to concepts that I wasn't expecting.
Yeah.
But we will have to somehow conclude today. And I wanted to ask you, what is it that we are not talking about, but we should be?
Oh, now that is an interesting question. I think that as a society, we do not talk about the ways that people react to being overwhelmed. I think we have large amounts of individuals and organizations that are just visibly not coping very well with the complexity of their daily life. And we don't really talk about that. And we don't talk about it in terms where we might actually be able to find solutions for it. And the trouble is that because we don't do that, people find their own solutions and they tend to be destructive.
Well, thank you, Dan. Your book has brought new knowledge into my life, and I'm very grateful for that.
Thank you very much. It's been so interesting. It's been a great conversation.